So back in 1516, Thomas More wrote this warning that the sheep in England had become, so wild that they were literally eating human beings.
Right, which is just this incredibly striking, terrifying image to kick off early economic history.
Yeah, and he obviously wasn't talking about like some mutant breed of livestock roaming the countryside. He was pointing at a very grim, very deliberate historical reality.
Exactly. Landlords had basically looked around, realized there was a massive fortune to be made in the booming international wool market, and did the math.
And the math said, get rid of the peasant farmers who had lived there for generations and bring in the sheep.
Yeah, you just picture these massive flocks grazing right over the literal ruins of torn-down villages.
Welcome to this deep dive. If you've been tracking with us, this is the third part of our 10-part series, The Deed and the Wage.
And taking a step even further back, it's the third series in our massive Rethink History trilogy.
Right, because we've already explored, the fundamental question of who owns the earth and the ground rules, and we traced the modern fight between capital and labor in the long argument.
But today, what we're doing today is really the absolute hinge of the entire trilogy.
Because we are testing a monumental claim. We're looking at the idea that the modern wage worker was not just some natural evolution of human society.
No, the claim is that the worker was actively, legally, and honestly sometimes violently manufactured when the English Enclosure movement completely divorced ordinary people from the land.
And that this matters deeply to you listening right now, because understanding this specific history challenges all those basic, unexamined assumptions we have about capitalism.
Right, it forces you to ask what it actually means to be free to sell your labor. Like, did the free market just naturally emerge, or was it a legally constructed corral?
So we are going to argue this thesis hard today, right, on its strongest historical ground.
But, and this is important, we will be completely scrupulous about separating the actual surviving documentary record from the famous economic theories that were, later built on top of it.
Right. So let's go back to Thomas More's devouring sheep in Tudor England. To put this in a modern context, this sounds exactly like a ruthless corporate restructuring.
Oh, absolutely.
The land is the factory, and the landlord realizes that pivoting the entire business model to wool production requires a massive layoff of the human workforce.
You enclose the pasture, and the husbandmen are just out on the street.
Except back then, there wasn't a street, and there definitely wasn't a severance package. You were just turned into a vagrant. And under Tudor law, if you were a vagrant...
You could be hanged.
Yeah.
Which is the bitterest irony of More's critique, right?
Yeah, the very legal order that evicted these families then turned around and violently punished them for being homeless.
Exactly. But, what you have to understand is that the Tudor state actually viewed this as a massive public crisis. They weren't purely on the side of the landlords here.
Right, because Henry VII passes an anti-enclosure statute all the way back in 1489.
He was terrified. I mean, depopulating the countryside was destroying the military backbone of the country.
Because you can't exactly draft a flock of sheep into the infantry.
Right. And Thomas Wolsey even ran a national inquiry in 1517 to literally audit these illegal fences.
And if you fast forward a bit to 1607, you have the Midland Revolt, which was this massive, bloody uprising specifically targeting these enclosures.
So the government clearly saw this social fabric tearing, and they tried, albeit pretty ineffectively, to patch it up.
But even with the Midland Revolt and all that Tudor violence, that wasn't actually the main event, was it?
No, not really. It was pretty geographically isolated.
Right. The real machine of dispossession, the one that completely rewired the DNA of the English economy, that came centuries later.
But before we get into the mechanics of that machine, we really have to look at the victim. We have to figure out what the rural laborers actually lost.
That valuation question is everything. Because if the commons were just, a muddy patch of weeds, then losing them is a tragedy of sentiment, but not survival.
Right, and Jane Humphreys did some incredible heavy lifting on this back in 1990. She basically built a forensic ledger of the commons.
Just pricing out what these customary rights were actually worth to a standard laboring family.
And looking at her work, the bundle of rights was staggering. It wasn't just, grazing a single cow on the village green.
Yeah, it was so much more than that.
Far from it. The bundle included pasture, sure, which meant keeping a cow or some geese or a pig, which is your dairy, your meat, your fertilizer.
But then you also had estovers, right?
Yes, the legal right to gather wood from the commons for fuel and for, repairing your cottage.
And turbary, which was the right to cut peat to keep the fire actually going through the freezing winter.
And then the most fascinating one to me, honestly, is gleaning.
Oh, gleaning is wild. This was the customary right to go into the harvested fields after the reapers had finished and just gather up the scattered leftover grain.
It sounds minor, almost like begging, but the sheer volume of grain a family could gather this way was
It
immense.
was enough to supply their bread for weeks, sometimes even months, right?
Exactly. Gleaning was this incredibly highly structured, community-policed activity. Families' winter survival often depended entirely on it.
So when you look at that entire bundle, the cow, the fuel, the gleaned grain, you realize you're looking at a robust, parallel household economy,
And crucially, this economy was heavily gendered.
meaning it was primarily the women and children doing this work.
Yes, the men might be out working for a daily wage on a larger farm, but the wife and kids are managing the commons capital.
They were the engine of this partial independence.
The commons were the poor man's capital. By managing the livestock, the fuel, the gleaning, women offset massive household costs.
They effectively insulated the family from the brutal fluctuations of the wage labor market.
Right, so when the commons vanished, that entire household economy collapsed inward. The family was suddenly stripped of its capital.
And forced to rely entirely on a single, highly vulnerable resource, which was the man's wage, or later, the children's wage.
Exactly.
But wait, let's play devil's advocate for a second. Doesn't that paint a slightly romanticized picture of the rural poor?
How do you mean?
Well, we have to be honest here, and we're looking at all the sources. A lot of these workers were already landless by the 18th century.
That's true.
And some scholars point out that these rights were legally tied to the ownership of specific ancient cottages, not just freely handed out to anyone who breathed the local air.
It's a vital piece of pushback. The poorest of the poor, like the true bottom tier of rural society, they might not have had strict legal enforceable rights to the commons.
Right.
But Humphreys and others demonstrate that informal and customary use was incredibly widespread.
Because landlords often turned a blind eye, right?
Yeah, exactly. Allowing the poor to take a little pee or graze a pig basically kept them off the parish relief rolls. It saved the landlord's money in taxes.
So while the exact monetary value is genuinely fiercely contested, the documentary record is clear. Losing the commons was a devastating blow to working-class independence.
The fatal blow, really.
So they had a massive amount to lose. Let's look at the mechanism of how they actually lost it.
Moving into the 18th and 19th centuries, the era of parliamentary enclosure.
Right, and the violence changes character completely here. It's no longer, a thug with a club tearing down your cottage roof.
It becomes this sterile, bureaucratic paperwork exercise.
Parliament passed over 5,200 individual enclosure acts between 1604 and 1914.
Which covers roughly 6.8 million acres. That is about a fifth of the entire land mass of England.
The transition from physical violence to bureaucratic violence is just chilling. Walk us through how this legal mechanism actually functioned.
Okay, so the large landowners in a parish would petition Parliament for an Enclosure Act. They wanted to take the ancient open field system.
Which was essentially a massive patchwork quilt of shared strips of land.
Exactly, and they wanted to consolidate it into the neat, square, privately owned fields that we associate with the English countryside today.
But here's the trick of the paperwork, and this is crucial. Parliament required a majority vote from the parish to approve the act.
Sounds fair, right?
Sure, until you realize they didn't count the votes by heads. They counted the votes by acreage owned.
Right, which meant a tiny handful of wealthy squires who owned, say, 3/4 of the land could easily outvote 50 smallholders.
It's totally rigged. And once the act was approved, commissioners were sent in.
They surveyed the parish, completely extinguished all the ancient common rights, and carved the land up into new, consolidated private parcels.
And this is where the real squeeze happens. Because even if a smallholder could legally prove their customary right and was, awarded a tiny plot of land as compensation.
They were suddenly hit with a massive bill.
Right. They had to pay their proportionate share of the Parliamentary Act itself, the surveyor's fees, and the commissioner's expenses.
And honestly, the true killer wasn't even the fees, it was the fence.
Oh, the fex.
The Parliamentary Acts legally mandated that every new parcel had to be physically hedged, ditched, and fenced by the new owner.
And that astronomical cost had to be paid in cash up front.
Yes.
Here's where it gets really interesting to me. It's like the city coming to you today and saying, great news, we are granting you a free plot of land in the center of town. But by law, you must immediately build $1 million retaining wall around it, and the bill is due on Friday.
Right, the math just doesn't work for you.
You can't afford the fence, and the new allotment is too small to feed your family anyway.
So your only rational economic choice is to sell your new plot of land to the rich farmer next door and go ask him for a job.
The fence didn't evict you, it just billed you into submission.
It was a perfectly legal, perfectly rational market transaction that essentially acted as forced expropriation.
But we should be fair to the people pushing this. The improvers, they weren't cartoon villains twirling their mustaches.
No, not at all. They had a compelling, highly rational argument for why this had to happen.
And Arthur Young is kind of the perfect lens for this, right?
He absolutely is. He was the greatest champion of agricultural improvement in the 18th century. Young spent decades traveling the country, armed with huge amounts of data, proving that enclosed, consolidated farms were vastly more productive.
Because with enclosed fields, you could actually manage crop rotation.
You could implement better drainage. You could control selective breeding without your neighbor's scrawny bull wandering over and mixing with your prized cows.
And the results were undeniable. Output skyrocketed. I mean, the population of England roughly doubled between 1750 and 1820.
And the enclosed agricultural system managed to feed them without a mass famine. That is a monumental achievement in human history.
It's a total triumph of efficiency. But Arthur Young was also deeply honest, which makes him such a fascinating figure.
He really was. By 1801, after watching his beloved enclosure movement reshape the country for decades, he actually conducted an inquiry into its social effects.
He actually looked at what was happening to the rural poor.
And he turned on his own cause. He literally wrote that by 19 enclosure bills in 20 night, they are injured.
He meant the poor.
Yes, the poor are injured.
And he recorded a quote from a rural laborer that just cuts through all the parliamentary jargon and economic theory. The laborer just told him, "I had a cow, and an act of parliament has taken it from me."
That single sentence is the autopsy of the English peasantry. It grew the harvest, but it destroyed the harvester.
So we have this massive documented divorce from the land. Let's signal a shift here because we're moving from the historical record into interpretation. How did later thinkers explain this?
Karl Marx is obviously the giant in the room here, writing Capital in 1867.
And it's important to flag this as an argument, a theoretical interpretation of the history we just discussed.
Right. Marx was trying to solve a puzzle. Where did the two fundamental characters of capitalism actually come from?
Because on one side, you have the capitalist with money and the means of production.
And on the other, you have the worker with absolute nothing to sell but their time.
So Marx looked at Enclosure and basically called it the founding crime scene of the capitalist system. He called it primitive accumulation.
He argued that society didn't just naturally evolve into wage labor, it actively expropriated the peasant from the soil.
By doing that, society manufactured a class of workers who were free in this double, highly ironic sense.
Right, free of feudal ties. They aren't serfs anymore, but also free of any property, leaving them nothing but their labor power to sell.
And decades later, in 1944, Karl Polanyi comes at this from a slightly different angle in his book, The Great Transformation.
He coins this brilliant, really sticky term, the fictitious commodity.
Polanyi argued that human life and human labor aren't actual commodities. They aren't manufactured for the purpose of being sold on a market like, a pair of shoes or a lump of coal.
Yes, exactly. To treat human labor as a pure commodity requires a brutal social demolition. You literally have to strip away all the social safety nets, the community ties, and the independent resources.
Like the common.
Until starvation forces the human being onto the market.
But Polanyi argues that society basically flinched at the horror of this. The commodification was so brutal that local governments tried to intervene to stop the social collapse.
Which brings us to the famous Speenham land system of 1795.
Right. Bread prices were soaring due to bad harvests and the French Revolutionary Wars. So a group of magistrates in Berkshire meet at the Pelican Inn in Speenham land.
And they decide to start subsidizing the laborers' wages out of the local poor rates.
They created this sliding scale. If a farmer paid a laborer below a certain subsistence level, the parish would just top up the wage,
indexing that subsidy to the current price of bread and the size of the worker's family.
Now, on the surface, that sounds incredibly humane. It's like a proto-welfare state stepping in to prevent mass starvation.
But when you look at the mechanics of it, according to Polanyi, it becomes a catastrophic economic trap.
Because if you are a wealthy farmer, and you know the parish taxpayers are legally obligated to ensure your workers don't starve, why would you ever voluntarily raise their wages?
You wouldn't. In fact, Polanyi argued the mechanism worked exactly in reverse. Farmers actively slash wages, knowing the public purse would just make up the difference.
So Polanyi argued Speen-Hamlin pauperized the worker. It depressed wages universally and demoralized an entire class.
Because working harder or negotiating better didn't matter, your income was statically pegged to the price of bread by the parish.
Now, we promised to keep this testable, and modern economic historians, people like Mark Blagg and George Boyer, have heavily revised Polanyi's doom-laden view of Speenhamland.
Right. They've run the numbers and argued it wasn't this universal systemic trap that artificially depressed wages across the board.
They see it more as patchy, rational crisis relief that successfully kept people alive during severe localized distress.
The revisionists have certainly dismantled the idea that Speenhamland alone destroyed the rural wage. But even if we strip away Polanyi's specific mechanical theory, an undeniable glaring fact survives.
Which is that by the early 19th century, a southern agricultural laborer's wage alone simply could not keep them alive without the commons.
Exactly. The wage failed to reproduce the worker. That is the bare historical fact, regardless of the theory you apply to it.
Which perfectly tees up the massive doubt we have to introduce here. We have to pause the momentum and honor our promise to you, the listener.
We've spent this entire time arguing the dispossession thesis that the fences created the proletariat. But there is a robust countercase.
The revisionist school, led by historians like J.D. Chambers and Robert Allen. Now, we are going to dedicate the entirety of Part 6 of this series to their argument, but we need to give them one honest paragraph right now.
Fair enough. So Chambers, writing in the 1950s, asked this brilliant subversive question. What if Marx had the causation completely backwards? Chambers looked at the data and argued that enclosing land didn't actually reduce the need for labor. It increased it.
Because someone had to physically dig miles of new ditches, plant millions of hawthorn hedges, and build the new roads.
Exactly. So if the fences were actually creating more jobs, where did this massive, desperate class of unemployed wage workers come from?
Demographics.
Yes. Chambers argued the massive growing proletariat was created by a booming population. There were simply way more people in 1830 than any land system could support.
And Robert Allen adds another layer, arguing that landlords quietly merging small farms into massive mega farms engrossment did way more damage than the parliamentary acts.
And that massive agricultural gains predated these paper fences anyway. So, listener, hold that doubt in your mind.
Because we have to return to the historical timeline to witness the emotional and physical breaking point of the dispossessed, the winter of 1830.
The Captain Swing riots. The southern and eastern fields of England essentially explode.
It's a massive wave of machine-breaking arson and wage riots. Landlords are waking up to find their hayricks on fire.
And they're receiving these chilling, anonymous letters signed by a mythical figure, Captain Swing.
And if you look closely at what these rioters actually wanted, it wasn't the vote, it wasn't socialism.
No, they wanted a living wage. And they wanted the absolute destruction of the new iron threshing machines.
Why the threshing machines specifically?
Because threshing grain by hand with a flail was exhausting work, but it was winter work. Without the commons, manually threshing the harvest inside the barns was the only way a family could earn enough to survive the winter freeze.
So when the wealthy farmers brought in the machines, they didn't just automate a task, they stole their winter work.
These rioters were the grandchildren of the commons. Because of enclosure, they had nothing left to withhold but their labor, and nothing left to break but the machines replacing them.
And the state's response was swift and brutal. According to historians Hobsbawm and Roudet, roughly 2,000 were brought to trial, 19 were executed, and around 500 were transported to Australia.
It was the largest single batch of transportations for a common protest in English history.
And just 3 years later, the New Poor Law was passed, and those surplus laborers drained into the factory towns, setting up the exact timeline we covered in the long argument.
So the divorce was final, and I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over. Think about how we use the term unskilled labor today.
Right.
This history suggests that the skills of the rural poor managing commons, complex dairy, sustainable fuel gathering, independent survival, they weren't just lost to time.
They were actively extinguished to create a workforce whose only remaining legally permissible skill was taking a wage.
Exactly.
That is profound. But remember, this divorce seems final, but the massive countercase is coming. Did Enclosure alone actually file the divorce papers, or was it a booming population?
Episode 6 is going to answer that question.
Like and subscribe. It really helps the channel reach others.